Okay, we are going to start the defendant's case. Kendall?
Your Honor, the defendant is called Dr. Arthur Konar.
You swear to affirm the whole truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? I do, Your Honor. Take a seat,
Dr. Konar, go ahead and introduce yourself to the jury, please.
Hello, my name is Dr. Arthur Konar. I'm a clinical psychologist and a clinical neuropsychologist.
Dr. Konar, how long have you been a clinical psychologist and a clinical neuropsychologist?
I received my PhD in psychology in 1985. I was licensed in 1986. I received membership into the National Academy of Neuropsychology in 1987, so anywhere from about 28 to 30 years.
Okay. Tell us what a clinical neuropsychologist or a clinical psychologist would do.
Well, what we do, clinical neuropsychology is simply a subset of clinical psychology. And in clinical psychology, what we do is we study and we treat individuals that have different sorts of mental illnesses and or exhibit different sorts of clinically established abnormal behaviors. Clinical neuropsychology, which is a subset of that, is really looking more specifically at different sorts of disorders that come from insults to the central nervous system.
As part of your profession, do you treat people who have mental illness?
Yes, I do.
Would those mental illnesses that you treat include schizophrenia?
Yes, to some extent. My work with schizophrenics, because I work in an outpatient setting, would really be more in regards to evaluations. Though when I have worked and consulted to specific hospitals and psychiatric hospitals, I've worked a lot directly with individuals with schizophrenia.
Okay. And do you, apart from your clinical practice, are you also employed at Iowa State University?
I was employed at Iowa State University from 1998 through May of 2014. I was a lecturer and then a senior lecturer, and I taught classes in psychological assessment. In fact, I taught the entire sequence of assessment classes to the counseling psychology graduate students. I also taught a class, or the primary class, in abnormal psychology, and I designed and taught a class in abnormal psychology in children and adolescents.
Okay. And so what would abnormal psychology be?
Abnormal psychology is really looking at all the various types of symptoms and behaviors and conditions and diagnoses that are really present in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders.
Okay. And that would also cover the area of schizophrenia as well, too?
Schizophrenia would really be considered, in many ways, kind of the flagship of the most serious type of mental disorder, yes.
Okay. I asked you to consult in this case, correct?
Yes, you did, sir.
And as part of that, did you review some medical records?
Yes, I did.
You know what I'm going to approach? I'm going to hand you what I marked for identification as Defendant's Exhibit C. Could you review that, please?
Yes, this is the record that I reviewed from the Cherokee Mental Health Institute from 1990 from Mark Konar.
Okay. Your Honor, at this time, I'd like to read into the record the stipulation of the parties.
Certainly.
Exhibit C was not produced until after the defendant was charged in this matter.
And that's the stipulation?
That's the stipulation and agreement between the parties.
Yes, sir.
And then at this time, Your Honor, I move into evidence Defendant's Exhibit C.
I'm sorry, no objection.
Exhibit C is received.
Doctor, I'll go ahead and take that back.
Sure.
Doctor, would you be able to, we've heard some testimony from some other witnesses that Mark Konar had been diagnosed with schizophrenia. Did you review the record in Exhibit C?
Yes, I did.
Could you tell us in Exhibit C, did that say anything as to the diagnosis of Mr. Konar?
The diagnosis in 1990 was that of paranoid schizophrenia, or more specifically schizophrenia paranoid type.
Okay. Can you basically just tell us what is schizophrenia?
Schizophrenia is an illness. It's really in many ways more of a syndrome than a specific illness, because people can be schizophrenic in various different ways. But essentially, the primary aspect of schizophrenia is going to be that an individual has distortions in reality, or they've lost good reality testing.
Okay. What is reality testing?
Essentially, by reality testing, what I'm saying is, is the person able to kind of understand or operate in the world in a manner which is going to be which is going to be accurate? And the manner in which reality testing ends up becoming impaired is primarily through delusions and hallucinations.
Okay. And I know that we've heard those words before, but in the medical sense, what is a delusion?
A delusion is an individual having distorted thoughts to such a degree in which it does not allow them to operate appropriately or accurately in society.
Okay. And what are hallucinations?
Hallucinations would be, as delusions are to thoughts, hallucinations are to perceptions. So hallucinations are faulty perceptions to such a degree, and they can be primarily auditory or visual or tactile. And these faulty perceptions, once again, occur for an individual, and in doing so, they end up interfering with that person's ability to work in society or to basically see reality in a manner which most people do.
Okay. So if I'm hearing you correctly, I'm just going to try to put it in layman's terms. A hallucination, you said, was a faulty perception?
Correct.
So people are hearing or seeing something that isn't real.
They could be hearing or seeing, quite honestly. They could also be feeling. They could be tactile. They could be gustatory. They could be tasting. They could be olfactory. They could be smelling. Oh, sorry very much. They can be, what I said was that they can not only can they be auditory or visual, but they can be feeling, which would be tactile. They can be gustatory, which would be tasting. So there are various different sorts of hallucinations a person can have. They really revolve around all of our senses.
Okay. How do you go about diagnosing someone with schizophrenia?
The way somebody is diagnosed with schizophrenia would be through behavioral observations. It would be through clinical interviews. It would be through record reviews. It would also be through doing either family interviews or interviews for people that have a lot of contact with that individual.
Okay. Now, and through that, are you assessing the symptoms that the person has?
Correct.
Okay. In your review of Exhibit C, did you observe symptoms that were noted that Mr. Konar had of schizophrenia?
Yeah, I wouldn't say observe, I said I read.
Okay.
Yes, but I read of symptoms that he had, which certainly would suggest that that would be an appropriate diagnosis.
And I do want to back up and clarify this for the jury. You've never seen Mark Konar, correct?
Of course not.
You were never a treating physician for Mark Konar?
No, I was not.
And I don't, we've talked before, but I don't think you've ever worked at Cherokee Mental Health Institute, correct?
No, I have not.
Okay, all you were doing here was just reviewing these records for me and going through some explanations to develop some more knowledge of what's in these records, correct?
That's the understanding of my charge, yes.
Okay. So, what types of things did you read in there that are symptoms of schizophrenia?
What I read really was kind of more of what we consider primarily positive symptoms of schizophrenia. And positive symptoms of schizophrenia would essentially be a pathological excess of problems or issues or conditions. And those would be the presence of delusions, and particularly the delusions that he had were delusions which were both persecutory and command delusions.
Okay. Let's take a break right there and talk about those two then. What's a persecutory delusion?
A persecutory delusion is exactly as it sounds, in which I believe that an individual is attempting to persecute me. I believe that an individual and or a group or an entity is doing something to place harm upon me.
Okay. The other type of delusion you mentioned?
Was a command delusion.
And what are those?
Command delusions are essentially that I believe that the voices that I hear, and this is going to be tying on in with hallucinations, but I believe that the voices that I hear are providing a command for me to act in a certain way.
Okay. And could those commands be to do certain behaviors?
Absolutely.
Could they be to interact with other people in certain specific ways?
Yes.
You talked about those being primarily positive symptoms. What would be a negative symptom?
Negative symptoms would be essentially the pathological, essentially absence of things which we use as people to interact with good reality testing. So there would be things like extraordinary social withdrawal. There would be the notion of flat affect. And by flat affect, what I'm referring to is not somebody being depressed or somebody being happy, but somebody that's showing kind of no affect, where they're just kind of like a blank face.
Okay, so no emotion.
Exactly.
Okay, and you said the other one would be where they've sort of isolated themselves?
Correct. And the third one would either be a poverty of speech, or sometimes it's going to be in which the person may speak, but they kind of speak in this extraordinarily soft manner so that you can't really hear them. So that it's another way in which communication is not occurring.
Okay, so that inability to speak loudly or clearly, that's a symptom of schizophrenia.
Well, that would be, yes, that would be a symptom of schizophrenia.
A negative symptom.
Correct.
Okay. You have to judge that in conjunction with all the other symptoms, though.
Absolutely. You can't look at one symptom and say, oh, that person is schizophrenic. It's really, as far as any kind of diagnosis, you have to have a certain number of these types of symptoms, and they have to have a certain extraordinary level of prominence for that diagnosis to occur.
Dr. Konar, once schizophrenia has been diagnosed, how is it treated?
It's treated primarily through medication.
What types of medications?
The medications have evolved over the time, but essentially the primary aspect of medications is that they are going to reduce the amount of dopamine and norepinephrine that a person has going through their symptoms, and these medications are called antipsychotic medications.
Will antipsychotic medications cure someone with schizophrenia?
No, they help them manage the symptoms.
Is schizophrenia curable?
At this point, no, it is not.
Okay. Can you tell us how does it play in with someone's schizophrenia as far as their insight into their own disorder or disease?
Well, about half the people that have schizophrenia are able to have some level of insight into the fact that they have this severe mental disorder, and unfortunately about half of other individuals don't have that type of insight. The going theory is that these individuals have had so much damage occurring to their frontal cortex that the self-awareness of having schizophrenia or a mental illness no longer is with them.
And you talked about damage to the frontal cortex. Explain that to the jury.
Our cerebral cortex, or essentially our brain, is divided into four primary sections. And the frontal cortex, and especially the prefrontal cortex, which is the front part of our brain, is the part that makes us most uniquely human in that it involves planning and organization, and it also involves essentially our ability to have self-awareness.
Doctor, if someone is being treated for schizophrenia, are they necessarily at any greater risk for violence than any other person out there?
No, they are not.
What about if someone is not being treated for schizophrenia?
If somebody is not being treated for schizophrenia, that is one of what's considered the three primary indicators of an individual being more likely to be violent.
Okay, what are the other indicators?
The indicators are A, a history of violence, B, essentially not taking medications for the schizophrenia, and 3, a history of drug or alcohol abuse that's occurring on with this.
Does someone's, we talked a little bit ago about somebody's insight into their own disorder. Does that play into whether or not they're at risk for a violent episode?
Absolutely.
How does that play into it?
Well, essentially, that would be considered kind of more of a mediating or moderating factor, because when somebody does not have an insight into the fact that they are just mentally ill, then they are going to, there's 2 things that are going to be true. A, they are going to be much less compliant, in regards to taking medications. And secondly, they are going to view the positive symptoms, those hallucinations and those delusions, they're going to view them as real. So a person, for example, who is schizophrenic, who is experiencing and taking medications, even if they are experiencing hallucinations or delusions, they have the ability to step back and say, you know what, I know this isn't real, but it feels real to me.
Okay.
And they can kind of attempt to talk themselves out of it. When an individual has that lack of awareness and is not taking their medications, they simply view those thoughts, those perceptions, they view them simply as realities. And if they're commands that they have to act on.
Is someone who has, who's not being treated for schizophrenia, are they always going to have hallucinations present?
Absolutely not.
Will those hallucinations come and go?
Yes, they will.
What about the other symptoms? Can they flip-flop between, say, predominantly positive symptoms and predominantly negative symptoms?
Most individuals with schizophrenia are going to have either predominantly positive or negative symptoms, and it's actually considered like a type 1, type 2 types of schizophrenia. But it's not that clean. And the truth of the matter is that even though people may be primarily type 1, which would be considered mostly positive symptoms, or type 2, which would be mostly negative symptoms, individuals really, like I said, it's really a syndrome, and the individuals with schizophrenia are not like coming out on a cookie cutter conveyor belt. They're going to have kind of their own recipe in terms of what their schizophrenia looks like.
Okay, so everybody's different, right?
Even within this, yeah, and that's really why I said it's really more of a syndrome than it is a specific illness.
But it's still considered a serious mental illness, correct?
It's considered along with a bipolar disorder 1, and probably more so than bipolar disorder 1, it's considered the most severe mental illness.
Okay. There was some talk in the medical reports about ADLs. What are ADLs?
ADLs are activities of daily living.
Give us some examples of ADLs.
Brushing your teeth in the morning, washing your hands, eating, shaving.
Why is it that people with schizophrenia have trouble with ADLs?
For a couple of reasons. The first one, and not everybody does, but many do. It's because, once again, there's this kind of lack of self-awareness. There's this lack of self-awareness that I may smell. There's this lack of self-awareness that other people matter and that you're kind of interacting with the world. Essentially, when I am not employing good reality testing, then I'm not doing the things that I need to do as a human being to appropriately interact with the world, because it doesn't meet a level of criteria that's important to me.
Doctor, we had heard some testimony in this case that Mark Costa got along well with his neighbor. If someone's having persecutory hallucinations or persecutory delusions, excuse me, not hallucinations, persecutory delusions, is everybody going to be bad in their mind, or are just some people going to be bad?
In most cases, it's going to be more some people than everybody, or some entities than other entities. So it may be that, you know, the IRS is coming up to get you, or it may be that this person is a bad person, but this person is a good person. One quality of individuals with schizophrenia is they tend to engage in a defense mechanism called both splitting and projective identification. And in these types of defense mechanisms, what ends up happening essentially is kind of good people and bad people are assigned, and individuals are given really unrealistic attributes.
Okay. You talked about splitting, and describe what that is.
Essentially, in reality, all of us have good and bad parts to us. And yet individuals with schizophrenia are going to frequently say, you are all bad, you are the devil, you are causing me pain, you are out to get me. And they may look at somebody and say, you are my godsend, you are my guardian angel. But they really see people in these kind of polarized ways.
Is it possible for people in the mind of the schizophrenic to go from one category to the other?
Absolutely, especially if somebody could be in the positive light, and then what can end up happening is that that individual could have done something, maybe it was benign, but all of a sudden the individual with schizophrenia thinks that they've been betrayed, or they think that the person's out to get them, and then they can flip from one category to the other.
We have a moment, right? Doctor, when someone has schizophrenia, can they go from sort of, I guess I'm going to use the word more of an active period of the disorder to a period of time where they're maybe managing their symptoms a little bit better, or their symptoms aren't as present?
Not only can they, but that's a very, very typical course. Most
Okay.
people with schizophrenia are not simply going to be active all the time. They're going to go from active phases to what's called residual phases, and then back to active phases again.
So over time, a person's not necessarily going to be exhibiting all of these dramatic symptoms all of the time, correct?
Correct, and in fact, it's really kind of helpful to not say, oh, that person is schizophrenic, because the truth of the matter is individuals who have schizophrenia sometimes don't behave like they're schizophrenic, and then sometimes they do.
Okay. Your Honor, I don't have any other questions for the doctor.
Cameron, Ross?
Thank you, Mayor. Good morning, Dr. Konar.
Good morning, sir.
Dr. Konar, I think you said this, but I want to make sure it's clear. You said every person that has schizophrenia doesn't act the same.
Absolutely, sir.
There's no one way one person acts with schizophrenia that another person is going to act.
Correct.
And a person who has schizophrenia can be attacked and killed, and it may have nothing to do with them having schizophrenia, correct?
Absolutely, sir.
And if I heard you correctly, you said most individuals with schizophrenia are not more dangerous to others than those in the general public.
I believe what I said, sir, is that treated individuals with schizophrenia are no more dangerous.
And then you gave us, and I want to make sure I had that right, you gave us 3 factors.
Correct.
And what were the reason I had down, you gave us history of violence was important.
Yes.
Not taking medication.
Correct.
And drug or alcohol abuse.
Correct.
What were those 3 factors important for?
Those 3 factors were important for an individual having a higher predictor of being violent with schizophrenia.
No other questions?
Thank you, sir.
No other questions, Your Honor.
May I say something?